Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. On behalf of our conveners, the Organization of the Amazon Treaty Cooperation, Deltares, MEDREC, the Swiss Agency for Development Cooperation, the World Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank, I want to give you a warm welcome to our seminar, Management of Shared Water Resources for Peace and Cooperation. We all know that water is essential for life, and we're witnessing the effects of climate change through floods and droughts around the world. Under this scenario, water security is key to sustain economic growth and to preserve the well-being of our populations. Now, 60% of the world water, of the water worldwide, 60% is in transboundary waters and watersheds. And these watersheds are home for more than 3 billion people. Therefore, water security will require to strengthen the collaboration frameworks among the multiple stakeholders in transboundary waters. As the effects of climate change are going to get worse, as it is predicted, in fact, Swiss Re estimates that the toll from climate change by 2050 will be close to $35 trillion. That's the equivalent of the GDP of the whole Europe, raising the possibility of conflict for water usage. Therefore, the effective management of these water resources is crucial to ensure peace and cooperation. In this session, in this seminar, in the first session, we're going to learn, among other things that will be addressed, are the complexities of peaceful shared water management, exploring how water dialogue can transform tensions into cooperation opportunities. In our second session, we will share best practices and lessons learned and provide insights into the governance mechanisms that facilitate effective collaboration, as well as the role that river-based organization can play into ensuring shared water management resources for peace and cooperation. And finally, in the third session, we will have an interactive workshop that will explore strategies for transboundary water cooperation, conflict resolution, and governance improvement. The session has been structured in three stages. First, we're going to have a keynote. Then we're going to have Q&A with the audience. Second, we're going to have Ignite speakers, and next we're going to have another room for question and answers from the audience. Before any further delay, let me give the introduction for Mike Staton. He's going to give us a keynote. He's the director of the Geneva Water Hub and professor of water diplomacy at the Graduate Institute of Geneva. He has led multiple research and supported water negotiations throughout Western Asia and Africa. His research focuses on transboundary water, conflict and cooperation, the influence of armed conflicts in water services, and the link between water conflict and health. He's the author of various books and journals, the most recent published by Oxford University Press in 2023. Mark, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Sergio. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well. And the presentation is also well seen.
Great. So ladies and gentlemen, excellencies online, it's a real honor for me as Director General of the Geneva Water Hub, Center of Competence on Water for Peace, to address this important session. It really is an important session because if what we do with water actually results in a little bit more peace in the world, then we'll have left the world a little bit better off than we found it and made a real contribution for future generations. So I'd like to get us thinking broadly about how to actually claim such a contribution. And I'll do this over the next 8 minutes by making 4 main points. First of all, that peace is the goal and peace is worth fighting for. Secondly, that fighting for peace through water means both ensuring fair water sharing and ending the weaponization of water. Third, that water diplomacy, which blends both of these aspects, holds enormous potential. And finally, that we need innovation, innovative alliances and thinking to guide our action. So first, I'm delighted that peace is the focus of this session and of the SIWI Water Week this year, because I've noted that we often set the bar much lower. If we happen to find ourselves talking about just cooperation, we're not learning from the decades of knowledge that we have about the negative forms of cooperation, all the coercive treaties that lock in inequitable sharing, and the risks of water management policy favoring processes over outcomes. We might lose sight of the goal. Cooperation is a means to an end, but not an end in and of itself. The goal is to share water intelligently and fairly. The goal is peace. But what is peace? Is peace just the absence of overt violence, the silence after the guns have stopped? Well, the experience in Germany suggests otherwise through 2 world wars. The conflict does not end when peace is imposed by the victors, and the absence of conflict does not mean the presence of peace. Better to think of peace as positive peace, being just and fair, and the existence of conditions which enable people and communities to thrive, as Galtung and Lederach have stated. But enabling positive peace means challenging established structures and vested interests. In this view, peace doesn't come easily. And as Desmond Tutu says, in an apparent paradox, peace is something worth fighting for. So it's laudable but not sufficient to encourage states and communities to cooperate. We must go the extra mile for years on end, pushing for transboundary water arrangements that are equitable and sustainable. Transboundary water arrangements which align with the principles of international water law are a foundation, a solid foundation for positive peace. The classic example comes from West Africa with the RBOs of the OMVS and OMVG, with Apollo Dakar leading the charge. But where wars are raging, peace will also come through stopping damage to water or use of water as a weapon. Because once a ceasefire is reached, or one side declares itself victorious, all the civilians who had nothing to do with the war remain behind. And these people need water. And very soon, cross-line coordination has to happen to provide that water. And the shred of humanity that required to germinate peace is preserved. Without supplying that water, no peace is possible. The Geneva Water Hub experience has shown that both aspects have to be present and on our minds when we're doing diplomacy, i.e., when water is shared equitably and spared from the ravages of conflict, the conditions required to enable peace can grow. And now I'd like to offer what may be a useful way of combining both aspects of water into our peace building and into diplomacy. I'd like you all to consider this. And I think first we should consider the nature of war and conflict. I think that too many of us still believe that conflicts start, peak, and then get resolved, as in this classic and well-known diagram. Most of the conflicts I've been involved never truly get resolved. They look more like this: a constant base stress characterized by cycles of escalation, de-escalation, re-escalation, protracted conflicts, like a wave crashing on a beach. In these contexts, water can be a source of conflict by creating political tensions when everything is latent. You can think of examples, or it can be a victim of war, such as the reverberating effects of explosions on water systems, which we've done several studies on. But water is also used as a weapon of war, for example, in Ukraine, and especially in Gaza, where people suffered deprivation of energy for water supply, destroyed water maintenance vehicles and pumping stations, and are denied the entry of relief equipment. See the documentation in the recent Oxfam International report and others by PAX, CEOBS, Pacific Institute, and the Geneva Water Hub. But even the most cynical amongst us have to admit the other side of water can be leveraged at similar points in the same conflict cycle. Water really can be an entry point to discuss political issues because rivers force coordination between communities and states. Consider how tensions along the Save lead to coordination that Northern Gawana has negotiated between Mozambique and Zimbabwe. Conflict can lead to cooperation if it's guided properly, and ultimately to peace. Water can also serve as a basis of dialogue because it is often seen as apolitical or a technical issue, which is readily discussed by technicians from all sides. And these discussions can be built on, politicized, diplomatized. as between Syria and Jordan on the Yarmouk River, for example, or perhaps on the Tigris. And finally, water can be used for mediation of wider political issues because the solution space that water opens up, discussing hydropower, food, benefit sharing, etc., can improve relations in other sectors outside water. The Nile and the NBI is an imperfect example here. Now, of course, this theory is confronted by the current reality that we observe in Sudan, Ethiopia, Ukraine, Gaza. But that's no reason to give up. In fact, the challenge obliges us to bring the two sides together. And for this, we have to remain committed and to innovate. And fortunately, we've got Melissa, Judith, James, and Lama to share some of their innovations. And I'll end this talk with one of the innovations we've started with Slovenia and with Switzerland, the Global Alliance to Spare Water from Armed Conflict, which Tanya Mishkova and Christian Futiger will be talking more about at the SIWI seminar tomorrow at 2 p.m., which I hope you can dial in for. And so I'll just leave you with the takeaway messages: work or fight for positive peace, end the weaponization of water, ensure fair water sharing, blend both aspects in water diplomacy and management, and never stop innovating. I thank you for your attention. Back over to you, Sergio.
Thank you very much, Mark. A wonderful keynote. Now we have some room for question and answers. Alida is on the chat. Alida, the word is yours.
Hi, Sergio. There's no questions right now yet, so we're encouraging everyone to let us know if there's any things that you'd like to ask our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. So then we can move to the next part of the session and probably have a larger Q&A at the end of the Ignite talks. Let me now introduce you to Melissa McCracken. She is Assistant Professor of International Environmental Policy at Tufts University. She directs the Shared Waters Lab and is an affiliate at the Center for International and Resource Policy, as well as with the Center of International Law and Governance at Fletcher's. She's an expert in environmental governance, policy integration, and sustainable development. Melissa, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Sergio. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Well, thank you for the invitation to speak with you today and to provide one of these Ignite talks. And I'd like to really follow along with what Mark was saying about how cooperation is a tool that we can get to peace, but we need to unpack cooperation a little bit more in detail because cooperation isn't always necessarily good. So I'll be talking a little bit more about what we mean when we say effective transboundary water cooperation. So when we say effective cooperation, we have to put this into a broader context. We know from the literature and from the research that's been done that cooperation is more common over transboundary interstate waters than conflict. And so you can see the report on the graph from the Basins at Risk project from Aaron Wolf, where there are more cooperative events, so the right side of the graph, than there are conflictive events. And we know that institutional capacity is one method for us to actually build resilience to the potential for conflict. But when we actually start unpacking, well, what are these cooperation events? What do they mean? What do they look like? What is their goal? It gets a little bit more of a nuanced picture. So when we think about cooperation and we look through the literature and through the practice, we can really see that there's 4 broad definitions of transboundary cooperation. The first, people tend to frame it as a legal perspective. So what are the treaties, the agreements, what are the substantive or procedural principles that are in place? Second, the institutional framing for cooperation. So what institutions are in place? How do you do joint basin planning? Some other joint activities that are put together in some sort of institutional arrangement. And then we have the last 2, which are less frequently talked about, particularly within the academic literature, which are the relational and the outcome frames of cooperation. And this is where cooperation gets into building relationships, inclusive stakeholders, building trust, having mutually beneficial outcomes, and actually achieving the goals that cooperation has set out to do. So these are some examples of what these different frames might actually look like when we're in a cooperative process. And these are all going to be very dependent upon the particular scale of that cooperative process, that basin, or that potential conflict that's arising, and the context. And so it's important to note in this context that this framework for cooperation is neutral. We are not implying any sort of normative understanding of good or bad to cooperation. Cooperation can be both constructive or destructive. And so it's important to think about that when we're advocating for cooperation, that we want to advocate for effective cooperation that is constructive. So my own work I summarize in the end with a definition of transboundary water cooperation, which I'll leave for you on the slide, and I won't read through right now for the sake of time. But what do we mean when we say effective cooperation? Effective is a hard word to define ultimately. It'll really be dependent upon the particular goals that you're working towards. So I would argue, and to accompany with Mark's presentation, that effective transboundary cooperation aims for both equitable and sustainable cooperative processes and outcomes. And to achieve effective cooperation, we need to really focus on the two areas that are less prominent in the academic literature and the research that's been done on transboundary waters, and that's the outcomes and the relational components of cooperation. So the circular diagram you can see is a model of what effective cooperation looks like, and you'll notice that the outcome and the relational circles are darker and also larger in color, as they're more important to actually achieving effective cooperation. And having the adequate institutional and legal frameworks are there as a scaffold to support those. But if you just have the legal and the institutional components without the other elements, you're unlikely to have effective cooperative processes that result in equitable and sustainable outcomes. So what actually makes cooperation effective when we dig into the details? What are states actually doing? What practices are in place? How does this actually work? So when looking at this from the data, we see that effective transboundary water cooperation has a couple of core themes that are pretty prevalent across a lot of different examples and a lot of different interviews and academic literature. One is that effective cooperation actually does something. It achieves established outcomes. Two, it sets up some sort of institutional capacity, so the legal and the institutional frameworks for those relationships and outcomes to be established. Three, there's participation within the process with open communication, and most importantly, in my opinion, the trusting relationships that this is built upon. When we think about what might cause a cooperation to not be effective, and there's particular barriers. So in my own work, there's over 25 different barriers that have been identified with respect to effective cooperation, and we can see differences depending on the actors with whom you're speaking as to what those barriers might be. But the most commonly referenced barriers that states might encounter in a cooperative process are the overarching context. So is there a history of negative political relations between the states? That's definitely going to be a strong barrier to effective cooperation. Is there adequate political will in place within the parties? Is there adequate national level capacity by those parties to work in those cooperative processes? Is there enough financing? And is there enough knowledge about the particular basin? So all of these put together can kind of help shape what we mean by cooperative processes, and in particular focusing on effective cooperative processes overall. So with that, just leave you with a few concluding thoughts, and I'd like to thank you all and happy to participate. And I'll hand it back to you, Sergio.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Wonderful presentation. Thank you very much for complementing so well and with such important comments and contributions. Let me now pass the word to Judith Termat. She's an expert in surface water and delta management at Deltares. Her research focuses on water governance, hydraulic engineering, and sustainable water management practices. Judith, the floor is yours.
Sure. Can you hear me, and do you see my screen?
Yes, wonderful.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to give a presentation during this session, during the really interesting so-called Water Week. And I'm happy to hear from the previous speaker, from Melissa, that she mentioned that the Rhine is a good example of cooperation, but also for bases that have a good cooperation, there is continuously work. It requires continuously work to go for to work on peace and sustainable water management. So I'm happy to share in this session the work that we do at the Rhine River Basin together with the three Rhine commissions. So let me introduce the Rhine River Basin first. In the Rhine River Basin, 16 million people live in 8 countries. And the main countries are the Netherlands, Germany, and Switzerland, but also part of the Rhine Basin is also in Austria, Italy, Liechtenstein, in France, and in Belgium. So and Luxembourg. So it requires international cooperation to manage these resources. And in the Rhine Basin, there is already a long tradition. So the oldest commission was already established in 1816. So that's the Central Commission for Navigation of the Rhine. And they work very much on inland water transport because the Rhine is also an important economic corridor in Europe. Then we have the International Commission for the Protection of the Rhine, and that was established already in 1950 with a focus on improving the water quality in the basin. And this is also the commission that makes the climate adaptation plan and the flood risk management plan for the Rhine Basin according to EU regulations. And here the formal agreements and about solutions and actions are made. And then we have the CHR, that's the International Commission for the Hydrology of the Rhine. And in that commission, the knowledge institutions work together to create more knowledge about the issues in the Rhine Basin. So, and there is an intensive cooperation between the 3 river commissions. And the river commissions also get support from research project of the Stars for Water that is funded under the EU Horizon project. The Rhine Basin also is the work for the Rhine Basin never stops. If you can see here on the left-hand side, for example, you see the geography of the Rhine Basin going from the mountains in Switzerland to the delta in the Netherlands. But what we observe in the Rhine Basin is more and more water extreme events, especially for low flow and high flow. And in 2018 and 2022, there were serious problems with inland water transport, for example. And what we see towards the future is the melting of the glaciers, and under extreme climate scenarios, there will be only one glacier left after 2045. So the river basin will transform, and that's why we need a paradigm shift in also in managing these water resources. What the CHR, so the Knowledge Commission, is doing to support this informed decision making is, for example, providing knowledge on what the impact is of climate change on the river discharge. So there were initiated a project on the impact of melting of glaciers and see what is the impact on the different discharges and what does it imply for navigation in the future. For example, instead of just a few days towards the future, we expect that it can be even 60 days or more. So then there will be a real shift in inland water transport, and we have to think ahead about this. And also the socioeconomic scenario project, that's we also look at the impact of growing water use and economic developments on the impact of the Rhine flow. So how does it changes? And we do this in co-creation with the stakeholder community as well as the research community from an early start. So the co-creation makes that everybody has the same understanding about what's going on in the basin and build up your narrative together. And this co-creation is also supported by the Stars for Water project. The Stars for Water project provides new data science and new innovative tooling and introduces this to the river basin organizations. So instead of having a complex or unstructured water problems in the basin, we go all together towards more evidence-based and think about adaptive and sustainable water management by combining all these data, information, and knowledge provided by the science community together with what do the stakeholders see, what do the river basin organizations see, or the representative from the policies in the countries. What is their understanding? What do they need for their decision support? And together we work on better become climate resilient in the river basin. And if you look at accessible data, for example, the project has made a metadata portal, not only for the Rhine Basin, but also for the other river basins in the Stars for Water project and also river basins beyond. So, for example, the Danube or the Duero that are also transboundary water river basins. We know already a lot about climate change impact, but we know much less on water use. So how do we incorporate that one in the decision-making process? Where are the data gaps and how can we make this data available? For example, by using new sources of remote sensing data or machine learning, all these kind of things that are not used yet by river basin organizations for their purpose. We make that accessible. So let me share at the end some lessons learned from the Rhine basins for future directions for transformative transboundary water management. So I think it's my personal opinion that it's not only about just providing data science and knowledge to the decision makers, but it's really about co-creation to get a common understanding. And it's not only about the water parameters, but we also have to look in what does it mean, this water shortage for the different water sectors. Like a few days less of navigation might not be a problem, but if the total value change will change because it's a significant change, it's getting disruptive for the economy. So we have to think ahead and we have to combine the different sources of data from the different countries. First, bring them together, but 1 and 1 is not 2, but 1 and 1 is 3. Or for the Rhine Basin, 8 countries' data sources will bring up new information if we integrate it together. So it's a co-creation effort. And it's not only about thinking about governance and expert as silo, but we have to bring them together. And then we can, on one hand, create better effective governance, but also, on the other hand, building common understanding between experts across borders. And by doing this, we create a joint message to ensure that stakeholders and also experts and others are informed uniformly and in time so we can adapt to climate change in the Rhine River Basin. So then I am to the end of my presentation. So looking forward to your questions or in the Stockholm Water Week at location, but I will give back to Sergio now.
Thank you very much, Judith, for bringing such a wonderful case from the Rhine. Now let me pass the word to James Dalton. James Dalton is the director of the Global Water Program at the International Union for Cooperation for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, working on global water resources management and policy advocacy. James, the floor is yours.
Right, many thanks, Sergio. I haven't got long, so I'm going to go straight into discussing effective governance mechanisms and stakeholder inclusion in transboundary water management. However, I'm going to first flip that question on its head, just so show some new data that's raising questions over how treaties operate in practice and are they the mechanisms that we should be looking at going forward. This graph shows the number of agreements signed for transboundary water management per decade, per continent since 1820, when some of the first agreements were signed. And you'll see in red, the most important element to understand there is that there was a peak signing of agreements in the 1990s. And that was mainly due to global environmental awareness increasing and also concerns over river flows, large infrastructure on borders and dams. And as a consequence of that, treaties were signed to be able to better regulate and build cooperation over those pieces of infrastructure, but also the impacts of them. So peak signing in the 1990s with a decline in the last 3 decades of agreements, as you see from the data. What does this mean in practice? Well, whilst the treaties are declining, they are becoming more diverse and they are shifting in issue area over time. So as you see by the increasing number of different topics demonstrated over the years, from more traditional entry points for treaties, which are around navigation, infrastructure development, and delineating border and security issues, we've seen over the last 100 years those types of issues broaden as the complexity of transboundary water management and the issues that affect transboundary agreements have become more diverse and more understood, but also at the same time more complex. So what are we seeing? We're seeing a peak in signing in the 90s and then a decline, that more agreements are actually being signed over subbasins, that there are more bilateral agreements signed between states, but often in multilateral basins. So not all the riparian countries have signed those agreements, that there are an increasing number of issues being included in those agreements, so they're becoming more diverse, and that the most common points of cooperation tend to be joint management, conflict resolution, data and information exchange, water allocation, although that needs improvement, and environmental protection. And that most agreements do not specifically mention core international water law principles, but the obligation to resolve disputes peacefully and prior notification is most common, but not always working in practice. And just to give a rather stark example of this, if you look on the left-hand side there, freedom of navigation being one of the principles of some of the older treaties, and you can see there that's an example of the Amazon being able to navigate through a river that is healthy and flowing well, to the present day, to climate change and competing needs, and drought in the Amazon, which means that navigation and many of the other uses are more frequently affected by climate change, and therefore the services from these systems are becoming more negatively affected and impacted. And the implications of that from an agreement perspective is that agreements need to be opened, looked at, checked, renewed, restored, reinvigorated. And that is a process that is very difficult to do, given countries lock themselves into certain agreements. And the reality is that whilst state-to-state dialogue on these agreements may believe that they're working well and that they're working comprehensively for the basin, but they may not be aware of the implications of climate change and competition on water resources within the basin, and very much at the local level and very much across the border. So changes in governance approaches are happening and are desperately needed. This sounds very harsh, but those overly political, technically outdated, i.e. not current to the current situation, and top-down governance frameworks often fail to reflect the real needs, interests, and priorities of the very diverse range of actors and sectors that rely on or can influence both positively and negatively transboundary waters. The decisions adopted by governments without stakeholder engagement often have less and less legitimacy and will likely find resistance in practice amongst those who are negatively affected, including at the sectoral level, not just individual stakeholders and communities, for example, because of the consequence of agreements that are not really relevant to the stakeholder needs. So public participation shouldn't really be seen as an obstacle to decision-making, but really as an opportunity to collect experiences, to enrich transboundary water dialogue and negotiations. And having them included in the whole decision-making process is really, really important to ensure that they are aware and understand planning measures that might potentially affect stakeholders and communities in transboundary basins. Therefore, this greater inclusive engagement that's needed is a greater inclusion of stakeholders to match the diversity of issues that we're seeing in treaty development. That figure at the beginning showing that whilst the issues are becoming more diverse, therefore so are the stakeholders who are both affected by them, but also who have solutions, who can actually deal with them. Water needs more people, more institutions, more capacity and more resources to better manage water resources under these increasing climate and competition challenges. So therefore, building trust with a variety of actors and sectors is critical. Establishing platforms of dialogue for these actors and sectors to be informed about potential measures and activities and to mobilize their support and capacities is crucial, and give the opportunity to people to engage in the process, increasingly not just for agreements, but for what we're seeing is a wider range of arrangements that actually work in reality. So maybe not state-to-state agreement, but much more mechanisms that allow cooperation to happen that are not formally state-to-state, but are potentially sector-to-sector or region-to-region across a transboundary basin. And finally, we adopt this through what we call our multi-level governance approach. Multi-level governance creates the opportunity for engagement in cross-sectoral platforms that are both outside or adjacent to the water sector. Water is affected by many other sectors. It doesn't have the power to really affect those in return. Therefore, working across those sectoral platforms is important. Dealing with externalities created by water management on other sectors or on the environment, for example, or those that affect water management, such as certain economic development approaches, for example, say mining, for example, can affect water management quality. Therefore, working across those sectors is important. Multi-level governance helps to identify, manage, and mitigate exposure to risks from different sectors and creates a more flexible approach to understanding the governance of the resource. It can empower multi-level dialogue and exchange from community level to national decision makers and create more sustainable outcomes and impact, therefore, because there is more to lose in the process, more people with something to gain from improved water management across borders. And it harnesses the power of diplomacy between sectors and scales and stakeholders to really understand what's happening, improve learning, and therefore take that into agreements going forward. Many thanks to colleagues at Oregon State and IUCN for the data they collected for the presentation, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, for bringing so eloquently the point of how treaties have changed and how important it is to work with multilateral governance. Now let me pass the word to Lama Ranjus. She works at One Water and is a doctoral candidate and research associate affiliated with the Institute of Political Science at FAU Erlangen-Nuremberg. She has her research focuses on human rights documentation practices in conflict context. Lama, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sergio. Thank you very much for having me today. I'm joined by my colleague who's on site will share the screen for my presentation today. So I'm part of One Water, which is a social enterprise in Germany. We focus on communicating water science and facilitating knowledge exchange among communities, researchers, service providers, and policymakers. Today, I will complement what the expert speakers, Mark, Melissa, Judith, and James said already, and present one way that we used at One Water to create effective communication and data sharing among riparian nations, which is essential for sustainable management of transboundary water resources. And this example is from our work, which is trying to inspire change through storytelling. So as mentioned before, one of the key challenges in advancing cooperation is how to improve linkages across communities, sectors, countries, and have a meaningful stakeholders engagement, as mentioned earlier by James. So one of the this is one of the components that critical to sustainable and equitable governance of water at all levels. We believe that we can mitigate this challenge by storytelling, as it is very powerful tool that we can transform our communication in it. Here's a visualized story tells us that due to the decrease in rainfall in Syria, 80% of the rain-fed wheat fields were not planted in 2021. By tapping into our natural ability to tell stories, we can make our messages clearer and more impactful, and our audience more inspired to act. So coming to from this core value, we have created the story of source to sea arteries.blue. This project uses a mix of interactive data, graphics, articles from academic researchers to photo stories from journalists. What you can see here in the screen is one of the arteries.blue platforms that we have created based on the request of UNDP Accelerator Lab in Syria. This platform featured the Euphrates to deepen the understanding and the awareness of the river. The ultimate goal of this platform to use accessible science communication infused with culture motives for more informed, inclusive decision-making process, influencing the future of the rivers worldwide. We created stories about culture and climate change and other issues related to the river. In this story, you can see the biodiversity story. We highlighted the rich ecosystem around the river, and we raised awareness about risk and challenges. Take the biodiversity rates along the river. So, for example, you can see here that we know that there is a lot of species that are under risk, such as the Euphrates soft-shelled turtle. It's critically endangered. And also that the beavers, the Eurasian beavers is locally extinct. So through these visuals, we can highlight what are the key information. We can also have a database that tells us about numbers about this information. We can actually write lengthy scientific reports about it, but what is more effective is to show what are the main species in this ecosystem and what are the species who are under risk, as you can see here in the slide. In the other story examples, we can go to the agriculture, for example. It's showing the changes along the Euphrates. In this story, we brought information about major crops. We used satellite imagery to show agriculture expansion and the land use change. We used photos and journalistic writing to talk about migration and other issues. Take food insecurity, for example. Instead of stating numbers about food insecurity or write about this issue, we use visuals to immediately capture the action needed and for where to direct it. We see here immediately 48% of the population is insecure in terms of food security, and 12 need immediate assistance. Another example we can talk, since it is this session about cooperation, we can go to the story of a cooperation. So this is, we wanted to state what was accomplished during the past years, what kind of agreements, the history of negotiating among the countries around the river, and most importantly, what is missing and the challenges faced in these efforts to guide decision makers to act on the key gaps in these efforts. One of the aspects is like how to make effective stakeholders engagement. And here we can also tell it in a different ways. We can, for example, bring a very complicated analysis to measure the level of cooperation among countries, or we can give a lecture about it, or we can use fictional characters representing different stakeholders saying their opinion about this subject, which we created in this website. We do believe as a human, we are wired for narrative and captivated visuals. It was the stories that brought us together, not numbers. In stories, we find meanings, connections, and ultimately change. This is one of the examples of arteries.blue, and we are hoping that we can create more platforms that can share database stories for transboundary rivers. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lama. I really want to thank Mark, Melissa, Judith, James, and Lama not only for having made your point so clear in the time that it was allowed, and for being so eloquent and for bringing the best of what you guys have. Now we have time to go to a Q&A session. Alida.
Yes, there is a question here from Claudia for Melissa. When talking about transboundary water, sometimes the countries involved can have very different institutional capacities and resources. How does this imbalance affect constructive cooperation, or are there any strategies to level the situation? Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Claudia. And absolutely, there's significant imbalances in terms of the amount of institutional capacity or resources that countries might have, and that will very much impact the ability to have effective cooperation. Ultimately, we might see that might create power imbalances between various actors within a negotiation, or even within just the management of a river on a day-to-day basis as those two states interact. So that's something that has to be addressed as we work towards creating that equitable, sustainable, cooperative process. In terms of how we might kind of work to level that playing field, if you will, often we can use international water law principles, so adhering to the conventions, applying to the customary law principles like equitable and reasonable use or no significant harm. Those can all help if states are actually willing to fully submit to those principles and implement them to help level the playing field, if you will. Having resources being provided to increase technical capacity, doing things jointly can also help to alleviate some of those imbalances as well, and working together. Really, it's just building that trust so that as there is some sort of potential power imbalance between the actors, that they're able to work through that in an equitable manner as well.
Thank you, Melissa. The next question here is from just popped up. The next question here is from Anita for Mark. Few would disagree with you that the human right to water should apply to those living through war, but bearing the goal of peace in mind. Why is this so important?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. I think it's that shred of humanity that we have to preserve, upon which any peace is going to develop. Think of the counterfactual. If there is, no water left, all the water has been used. If the victor has damaged all the water systems and lost all the faith of the population that they're now controlling, then there's, basically to arrive to that point, you'd have to see the others as not as equal human beings. Sparing water, leaving no one behind, even in conflicts, and making sure that we do see people as humans who deserve water as a human right, and for all the other reasons, means that the dynamic after the guns stop, the cooperation has to happen, because the water has to be restored at some point by the people who are now in control of whatever territory it is. Or if it's cross-border, the coordination has to continue, has to restart. And then that's very technical discussions, getting in a lot of pipes and pumps, etc. And those technical discussions at that moment in time can and should be politicized and diplomatized towards peace. Of course, that's in the most extreme situation. But I think that's why we can't we can't take our eyes off of those types of situations, because they exist, and war seems to be more of a frequent way of doing politics these days.
Thanks, Mark. I just want to also here have a question that I think would be maybe most appropriate for Judith, from Esme, saying, we've had inputs on transboundary cooperation, maybe not necessarily being constructive. And then the example of the Rhine where peace already exists. What about transboundary cooperation in fragile and conflict affected settings? Do you have any thoughts or reflections on this? And this is maybe also for anyone else who has an answer to this as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lida. The Rhine has a long tradition of cooperation, and of course, it's a peaceful situation. But in other countries that we work, like for example in Mali and so on, we also, in principles, it's all about the dialogue of the water resources and involving the community. So not only the actors but also the community and the people on the ground. So by getting a common understanding of their water system, by discuss what do you see in practice for when there is flooding, where is it, who is involved, who is affected, and all these kind of conversations, and mapping the systems and the dynamics in there. We bring people together, bring their to a higher level and to a better communication of level, so everybody can play better their role. And this also contributes to formulating collective action, I think. So, this is more in what we do in the Water, Peace and Security project. And there will be a session also later this Stockholm Water Week. So if you want to know more about this, I recommend that you attend these sections. And also Audrey, who can tell more on this program, will be in the session tomorrow, session 2 of this seminar.
Thanks, Judith. I have a question for James here from Fabrice. Does this decline that you were speaking of not also reflect the increase in conflicts between states? Doesn't cooperation depend on good relations between states?
I would say actually that states will get quite far down a level of disagreement before water tends to be the thing that they pick on. All out war is obviously a case in point. That's when things get extreme. But actually, states enjoy a whole variety of on-off, closer relationships and all sorts of things to do with borders, trade, diplomatic relations. But water doesn't tend to be the thing that they pick on as something that's going to be the hot topic. So I think it's not necessarily the decline in agreements is not an indication of an increase in conflict. I think it's more the fact that states are finding other ways to cooperate and agree on water that does not require treaties. And that's through, in some ways, handing that responsibility to other sectors of other parts of government. It's handing it over to other stakeholders, such as the private sector, utilities, and others who can actually manage the water resources and have good cooperation across states without it needing to be state-to-state dialogue. So I think the data doesn't generally reflect a lack of cooperation. It's more that cooperation is changing from formal approaches to less formal and a wider range of arrangements.
Thanks, James. Anna Kummelstedt is asking, how can hydrohegemony on a river basin be used as a weapon of war? For example, thinking of unfair treaty agreements in favor of the hydrohegemony, and how does it impact effective cooperation? She did not pose this to a specific speaker, so anyone who feels they can answer this question, feel free.
I can answer that question if that's all right. It's a great question, and it talks to what Melissa was talking about. Not all cooperation is a good thing. You know, there has to be effective cooperation or leading to what we hope would be good outcomes. And the question also speaks to the fact that, you know, there are very different types of neighborhoods we all are operating in. The Rhine, thankfully, today is a great example of cooperation. What was it like in 1938 or 1942 or 1946? How did that cooperation happen? You know, how come it wasn't happening there? Because the Rhine was very polluted at that point. There was very little coordination between the states because of the political context, of course. And I think the question about treaties also, and all this analysis that we're doing about treaties is really, really helpful, because the treaties that we're writing today are necessarily a lot better than the old treaties. old treaties, thinking about, the 1959 Nile Agreement, the 1975 Helmand Agreement, the 1983 Yarmouk, or 1994 Israel-Jordan, and 1995 Israel-PLO agreements. All of these were skewed agreements, skewed and also outdated. Well, skewed and so unfair, that more tilted towards the more powerful party, the hegemon at that point. But they still exist, and they're still held to, because even treaties supplant international law. And so the treaties are still in place, still problematic in these tougher neighborhoods. So here, I think all the good work that's been done on treaty analysis should feed into our diplomacy, so that we revisit, update these treaties. If they're unfair, that's one thing, but they're also all outdated. They don't incorporate climate change. Most of them don't even talk about the environment, certainly not participatory. Think about the 1950s context within which they were written. So they all would benefit from being updated anyway. And at that point, to be equitable, you could and should use the principles of international water law to guide allocations, as Melissa was saying. Thanks again for the question.
Thank you so much. I think we're closing. We're close to the end, so I think a lot of you have still sent some questions in the chat that we really would like our speakers to answer for you. If you leave your details in the chat, then we're very happy to get our speakers to maybe send you written answers by email. And I will just move to Sergio to do the closing remarks.
Thank you, Alida. Thank you very much to all the speakers for wonderful presentations, for being on time. Thank you very much to the audience for being so attentive and for sending us such good questions. The conversation continues. We have 2 more seminars. The key takeaways that I take is peace is worth fighting for, as Mark told us, as Desmond Tutu told. Peace is the goal. Conflict can lead to cooperation if it's properly managed. Water can be used for mediation and improve relations, but it's important to unpack cooperation, that if it's effective and it's constructive, can be good, but it can also be bad. We discussed some of the barriers and things that need to be taken into consideration. We have also learned how does an ancient collaboration like the Rhine from the 1800s is telling us that the work never stops, that with climate change, the new challenges are coming, and that involving the stakeholders, the government, and the industries, it's key to be able to move the agenda forward. How the treaties have changed, and they are more diverse and more complex. That in the past they used to be of navigation, but now are talking about joint measurements, conflict resolutions, and information exchanges, and that the top-down approach does not address or the legitimate needs that today exist, and the public participation enrich the agreement, and it's important to build trust and to build a new multilateral governance, and that communication and the data sharing and the storytelling are probably the most eloquent and the best way to communicate and to share best practices, risks and challenges and lessons learned, because we can do it in a more clear and a more impactful way. Again, this is just a summary. This session is recorded. I have learned a lot. Thank you very much to everyone for participating. And remember that we have a hybrid session on Tuesday the 27th from 2 p.m. to 3:30, in which we're going to talk about unifying waters, the role of diverse reverse-based organizations, fostering cooperation and shared waters. And we have our last session, which is a workshop, a wonderful workshop, Wednesday the 28th from 11 to 12:30. It's a workshop on hydrodiplomacy and regional water resources management. Thank you very much to everybody. It was a great session.